Hello, welcome to part 1 of lecture 14. We're going to continue with the endocrine system. This lecture concerns the adrenal glands, and this material once again is from chapter 16 in Marib. Let's first look at the anatomy of the adrenal glands. You can see the adrenal glands are perched on top of the kidneys and are therefore sometimes called the suprarenal glands. You'll notice they're a little bit yellowish in color. That yellow color, as we'll talk about in a little while, is from the fat, the cholesterol, that the steroid hormones are made from. The other thing you'll notice, as we mentioned when we talked about the thyroid, is the extensive circulation that we have to the adrenal gland, which is typical of most endocrine organs. So we have suprarenal arteries because these feed the suprarenal gland, and you notice that we have several of these. They come from the top, they also come from the bottom, and then we have venous drainage down here by the suprarenal vein. Now, one thing we'll see in the cat is that the cat's adrenal glands are not on top of the kidneys, but are a little closer to the aorta over here. So there's a little bit of a difference between the cat anatomy and the human anatomy. We'll see that in the laboratory. Now, if we look histologically at the adrenal glands, we'll see that they are actually composed of two separate anatomic and functionally distinct sections. There's an outer part that's known as the adrenal cortex. So here's the outer part. The inner portion of this is known as the medulla. And we're going to see this several times in the course from here on, where we're going to have organs that have a cortex and a medulla. Cortex always refers to the outer part, medulla to the inner part. Now these, as we just said, are functionally and anatomically distinct. In fact, the adrenal medulla contains sympathetic postganglionic neurons. We have a sympathetic preganglionic neuron, and actually comes down and then will innervate this. So the sympathetic preganglionic neuron, if you remember from A&P1, this uses acetylcholine as the neurotransmitter. So the sympathetic preganglionic neuron will release acetylcholine, and it will cause the adrenal medulla to release their hormones, which we'll talk about in a second. So this is really a neural mechanism of hormone release. On the other hand, the adrenal cortex has some different hormones that are released by a couple of different mechanisms that we're going to talk about in a little while. Now, if we look at this histologically and blow this up, you'll notice that we have several different zones in the adrenal cortex. We have an outer zone called the zona glomerulosa, a middle zone called the zona fasciculata, and an inner zone called the zona reticularis. In general, each of these zones secretes a different class of hormones, and we're going to talk about those in a little while. You'll also see that the outer portion of the adrenal gland has a connective tissue capsule, similar to the capsule that we saw when we talked about the thyroid gland. Let's begin talking about the hormones of the adrenal medulla. The hormones include epinephrine and norepinephrine. About 80% of the secretions from the adrenal medulla are epinephrine, about 20% are norepinephrine. Both of these hormones are derived from the amino acid tyrosine, and they are called catecholamines. So this is an important word for you to remember. Not surprisingly, both of these hormones are part of the fight or flight response, which makes sense when we think that it takes a preganglionic sympathetic neuron to cause the release of these hormones. And once again, this, remember, is a neural mechanism or neural control of hormone release, since we have a neuron stimulating the release of a hormone. Now, some of the things that epinephrine and norepinephrine do, as you can imagine, would be part and parcel of the fight or flight response. Increase in heart rate and blood pressure, dilation of respiratory passages, promotion of glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis. Both of these, if you remember, are designed to increase glucose, as we said when we did our metabolism lectures and nutrition lectures. These also activate the reticular formation. From A&P1, remember the reticular formation is a part of the brain stem that actually wakes the brain and causes it to go into a heightened state of arousal or awareness. And finally, the hormones increase metabolic rates throughout the body. This makes sense because we have a heightened state of activity throughout the body when we have our fight or flight reactions. Now let's turn our attention to the adrenal cortex and the hormones it secretes. Once again, remember that the adrenal cortex from the outside has a yellowish appearance due to the stored lipids. Primarily cholesterol, because cholesterol is used as the starting point for the steroid hormones that the adrenal cortex produces. And these are about 25 different steroid hormones. We're not going to learn them all. What we're going to do is we're going to take each zone of the adrenal cortex and then talk about the major class of hormones that's secreted by each zone. In general, the hormones of the adrenal cortex are known as adrenocorticosteroids, also sometimes called corticosteroids. Remember the hormone that's secreted by the anterior pituitary that we talked about, ACTH, that was adrenocorticotropic hormone. The adreno, as we said, refers to the adrenal gland. The cortico portion of it refers to the adrenal cortex. Tropic, as we said, because this hormone controls the release of other hormones. Now, the adrenal corticosteroids are fatty type hormones that don't get along well in the water of the plasma, so these need to be carried by proteins in the blood called transportins. The other thing we'll mention is that the hormones of the adrenal cortex are essential to life. It might surprise you to know that the hormones of the adrenal medulla, epinephrine, norepinephrine, are actually not essential to life, but they are essential to having the body meet emergency situations. Now, we don't have these adrenal cortical hormones stored in the cell, and as we'll see later, this is going to be part of the exhaustion phase of the stress response because we don't store these in the cell, and the adrenal cortex can only make these hormones so quickly. So let's talk about the first class of adrenocorticosteroid. This, as you see, comes from the outer layer of the cortex, which is the zona glomerulosa. And the class of hormone that we're going to talk about here is called a mineralocorticoid. So from the name, you would guess that these have something to do with the activity of minerals in the body. And in fact, this particular hormone that we're going to use as a representative of this class controls levels of sodium in the body. This hormone is known as aldosterone, as you can see on the top. And what aldosterone is designed to do is to increase blood volume and pressure by promoting conservation of sodium ions at the kidney. So what does all that mean? Well, one of the things that we're going to come to, and one of the phrases that we're going to use from here on in the course, is that water follows salt. We can generalize that a little bit and say water follows solute. And if we think of this salt here as a solute, we can say that wherever sodium goes in the body, water will follow by osmosis. So if aldosterone can move salt back into the body, it will also allow water to be pulled back in the body. So ultimately what this does is to increase blood volume and pressure by conserving sodium ions as well as water. Let's take a look at the loop and how this works. This is actually known as the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. We're going to come to this a little bit later when we talk about the kidneys, but let's describe it here. First, you'll see that decreasing blood pressure and or sodium concentration in the plasma stimulate the secretion of an enzyme called renin from the kidney. And the renin goes into the blood, and it causes the conversion of something called angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. You remember this OGEN ending on this means this is an inactive form of an enzyme. Angiotensinogen is made by the liver, and it's always circulating in the blood plasma. It's only when it's exposed to renin that's secreted by the kidney that it gets converted into angiotensin 1. Now, angiotensin 1, for all intents and purposes, really isn't active in doing anything other than, very importantly, providing a substrate to be converted into angiotensin 2, which is really the active form of this. And the way angiotensin 1 gets converted into angiotensin 2 is by an enzyme called angiotensin converting enzyme, which is generally found especially in the lung capillaries. And the angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE, will convert angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. Now what happens is angiotensin 2 stimulates the adrenal cortical cells to release the hormone aldosterone. And then finally aldosterone will act to conserve water and sodium ions at the kidney, bringing blood pressure and or sodium ion concentration back to normal, and that will decrease the secretion of renin from the kidney. So this is our classic negative feedback loop for aldosterone. So the renin-angiotensin system that we just described is one of the ways that aldosterone can be stimulated to be secreted. The other way is by direct changes of sodium and potassium. As we said, if we have decreasing sodium concentrations in the plasma, we have an increase in aldosterone secretion, or if we have an increase in potassium. So decreasing sodium, increasing potassium, both of those stimulate the adrenal cortex directly to secrete aldosterone, and the other mechanism that we have for its secretion is the renin-angiotensin system, sometimes also called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. The next class of adrenocorticosteroids that we have are glucocorticoids. These are secreted by the zona fasciculata, which is the middle layer of the adrenal cortex. Now these hormones, as the name implies, affect sugar metabolism, so they affect levels of glucose in the body. The representative hormone that we're going to talk about is called cortisol, sometimes also called hydrocortisone. And generally what these will do is increase blood sugar. They decrease protein synthesis. They increase protein catabolism, and if you remember, we talked about the fact that proteins can be used for energy by breaking these down into amino acids. These then undergo the process of deamination, and then these can be used for energy. So proteins can be used for energy in this stepwise process. They also increase the release of fatty acids. This has what we call a glucose-sparing effect. What that means is that if we have body tissues that can use something other than glucose for fuel, and we have that fuel available, it will spare glucose for those tissues that particularly need glucose to work, like the brain, for example. It also stimulates gluconeogenesis. This is the creation of new sugar, if you remember, from things that aren't sugar, like pyruvate oxaloacetate. The release of cortisol, hydrocortisone, is controlled by ACTH from the anterior pituitary. And if you remember, release of ACTH is controlled by corticotropin-releasing hormone that comes from the hypothalamus. So this would be a hormonal mechanism of hormone release, since we have ACTH, a hormone, controlling the release of cortisol from the adrenal cortex. Once again, we have a classic negative feedback loop. You see here that the hypothalamus secretes corticotropin-releasing hormone. That stimulates the release of ACTH from the anterior pituitary, and that in turn stimulates the release of cortisol. And we talked about all the different actions that cortisol has above. When we have rising levels of cortisol, this will turn off CRH and ACTH secretion. So this is once again our classic negative feedback loop. The only problem with glucocorticoids is that they have anti-inflammatory and anti-immune effects. And the problem arises after somebody has a chronic level of secretion of glucocorticoids, or maybe somebody's taking steroid drugs for a chronic inflammation or something else. What these can do is depress the immune response and open the patient up to more infections. So this is a problem with long-term steroid use or with long-term stress response, as we'll see a little bit later. The last class of hormones that we want to talk about for the adrenal cortex are the adrenal androgens. These are produced in the zona reticularis, which is the innermost layer of the adrenal cortex. And these are adrenal androgens, andros meaning male. So these are male hormones. These are also called gonadocorticoids. And what these do is to supplement the sex hormones that are produced by the gonads. In particular, they produce a precursor of testosterone, which is known as dehydroepiandrosterone, so DHEA. These can be converted to estrogens in the female. Their primary effect is in women, where they might have an effect on sex drive. There can be a problem, though, when there's a tumor of this region of the adrenal gland. This can lead to something called androgenital syndrome. This is masculinization. So in women that have increased levels of DHEA, this can cause some male traits to appear, for example, increased hair growth, perhaps deepening of the voice, redistribution of fat, and those sort of things. So this is called a masculinization syndrome, and this can result from tumors in this region of the adrenal cortex. Okay, that finishes off part 1 of lecture 14. We'll finish off the entire endocrine system with part 2 of lecture 14. I'll see you next time.